In today's chapter, we're going to be talking about inspiration and where it comes from. In my experience, it can be found anywhere and everywhere, whether it's from nature, in books and magazines, or from found objects around the home. We're going to have a little look at what gets me started, and maybe it will help you with your journey to begin painting. So you're going to begin your journey of inspiration by just pulling and gathering lots of different bits and bobs from all over. The key is to just be a little bit of a hoarder about these things. You can be a neat hoarder if you want to be. I'm a bit of a magpie, so, you know, I'm like, ooh, I'm going to put this sparkly earring on my mood board today because it always makes me happy, you know, or I found this feather, which is like my lucky feather. It goes everywhere with me, but it always inspires me. And I'm not going to paint a feather, but I just like how it sits next to these colours. And a journal or a sketchbook is a really good way to start sort of pulling these things together and forming your own style and getting to know yourself. And over time, you'll get used to doing something maybe like a mood board. This is something that I begin before I start any project, and usually I'm creating for a client or I'm doing a set of paintings, so it could be like 8 paintings. And I know that before I begin, I really want to get my palette started. I want to get excited about what I'm going to be painting. So I start gathering and I start collecting and I start laying things down.
We're not actually going to be painting any of these things, but we want to build a foundation and figure out a colour palette and get inspired.
And the way I typically work is by moving around the board with colour and form and just placing things so that they please me visually, because I'm the only one seeing this. And it's just so that when you come in the morning, it gets you sort of excited. It gets you sort of, the brain starts sparking with ideas. So for example, here, I'm just using these embroidery threads. They're lovely because you can move them around and change your colour palette, see which colours you like together. I've just used a foam board as my board, and you can pick those up from any office supply store. And you could do a little one. This just happens to be a big one. But I've got a little bit of colour here. That was the start of a painting. And the reason I popped it on there is because I was thinking I could just see how some of my flowers, before I actually paint them, look on this background, on this darker background. And just start playing around with things. So I often lay them down before I begin. I've got a couple of little sketches that I did here, sort of layout ideas. So this is my tin of bits and bobs, but mainly it's little bits of fabric that I picked up from a fabric store, the little samples that you can get before you buy a long yardage. I snuck a couple of them, and I've been collecting these over time, and I find them very useful to help me to establish a colour palette. And sometimes to challenge myself, I shut my eyes and I dig in, and whatever comes out are the colours that I'm going to use. That's just what I do, just to change it up. So when I do a blind grab and just throw them on the table and see what I have to work with, usually I'll then kind of play with the colours that have come out, and I tend to put them in tonal families. So I might put these together, and then I start taking away the amount of a colour that might go in it. So actually, I might just use those with just a tiny touch of that green. But I like that challenge, because sometimes I get a bit overwhelmed, like, will that colour work with this colour? Will this? And the only way to really find out is to just give it a go. And we can tend to kind of gravitate towards the same colours all the time, and I find this a really good way to just kind of get out of my comfort zone a little bit and just make it work. And so you could do the same thing with these threads, just kind of mix them all up, grab a few, chuck them down, and then just work with those. There's really no right or wrong way to do being inspired. Just start throwing things down and see what sticks. You don't know until you try, and it's the experimentation that will really lead you in interesting directions. I'm going to just snip some of these flowers and drop them down onto the paper. Just seeing it separate from its stem is a whole different way of looking at what could be. So maybe I'm going to paint just a lot of the heads of the flowers, and I wouldn't have even thought about that had I not removed it from the plant itself. So snipping away, like just taking a leaf from something and throwing it down next to something else is going to just change how you mentally had thought you might do something. So let's grab one of these guys, these little guys here. Like, what happens if I get rid of the stem? And I just pop it down on top of those pinks. Do I like, I think that's gorgeous. And maybe that ends up being, you know, if I was doing a textile design, maybe it's a tossed head of a flower. And this is a lovely way for me to be inspired and begin that design process. Maybe let's take this daffodil head. I used to be terrified to do things like this, to like snip a flower and, you know, ruin it. You're not ruining it. You're just seeing it in a new way. Like, look how lovely that sits next to this tone here. Or maybe you turn it on its side. And just using one flower head and moving it around and changing the direction will give you 100 different ways to paint a flower. So let's pop him down there. See, we've got some of these incredible pansies, one of my favourite flowers to paint. And this one's called a brushstroke pansy. And it's got these lovely little marks that come out. There's a few more of them down there. There we go. And maybe I'll keep the stem and maybe I'll just like put that in the mix, but put it separately. Let's see what it looks like on here. Gorgeous. Or with that lovely ochre colour. And already I can see the beginnings of a painting just in this tiny section, with the majority of the background colour being this gorgeous ochre, and then all the colours within that pansy. Maybe that's my palette and I call it a day. So if you think of all the different moments on this mood board that can take you in a new and interesting direction, honestly, just keep throwing things down and see what sticks. How you pull together your inspiration is very personal, and it doesn't have to be with a giant mood board. It could just be an idea that you have in your head and you're ready to go. It's completely up to you. This is just how I like to begin before I start a project. Inspiration can be found anywhere and everywhere. Get out into nature. Get out into your community. See what's available in your house, your garden, or your neighbour's garden. I think the best thing to do is when you have an idea, get it down. Even if you write it in notes, if you don't have a paintbrush in your hand, just write it in your notebook. See what leads you down the path of inspiration.